Okay, so I specifically want to talk about escape velocity for based sequencing. This has been a very contrarian idea when it was first introduced, and I think we're finally getting to a point where it's probably going to happen on mainnet in production in a relatively big way, hopefully. So I have two parts. The first one is that I want to try and motivate base sequencing and base pre-confirmations, tell you about the secret long-term master plan. And then secondly, I want to try and highlight all of the progress that we've made in the last year with sequencing. So the big mission really here in the top left corner is to fix Ethereum fragmentation. And you know, it might seem a little disconnected because preconfs is all about improving UX. It's like, how are these two things connected? And the way that I connect the dots is that basically at the very top, we have pre-confirmations that improve the UX of decentralized sequences, such as base sequences. And then that gives us credibly neutral decentralized sequences that can be used as shared sequences with very good UX. And then once you have these shared sequences, then you unlock network effects that are basically born from synchronous composability. So this is the big thesis, that when you have shared sequencing, you unlock these really powerful network effects. And then these network effects, as network effects do, kind of lead to clustering, right? There is a benefit to joining the network, and so more and more entities join the network. And then you enter this meme of the united chains of Ethereum, and you fix fragmentation. So it's a long journey, it's a kind of a long shot, but we're moving very, very fast and in the right direction, in my opinion. So here's how I think some of the clustering will happen in the short and medium term. So I think we're going to see some of the big ecosystems have their own sequencer within the clusters, and then we're going to see kind of this awkward and grassroots effort, which is maybe more loosely coordinated, which is the base cluster, and it's just going to be all sorts of independent app chains and general purpose rollups coming together. And then over time, because of these network effects, we're going to see clusters merging. And so the question is, for example, are we going to see the superchain cluster merging with the Arbitrum Orbit cluster? And I think the answer to that question is no. It won't happen directly because there's a lot of ego at play. There's a lot of branding and tokens and stuff like that. And so I think the only way that we can have an Ethereum-wide supercluster is by basically going through an intermediate, credibly neutral cluster. And so the way that a potential way that things will play out is that the based cluster will just start encompassing and merging with other clusters, because that's the only one that can merge with other clusters because it is credibly neutral. And then hopefully, eventually, we get to this point where we can fix Ethereum fragmentation. Okay, so next I kind of want to highlight all of the great things that have happened in the last year. But I guess let's start with a little bit of prehistory. So first, the term base rollup was coined in March 2023 in an ETH research post. And then for a very long time, nothing happened. People were not interested in this. And I think the main reason was that the 12-second slot times was just not competitive for it to be a credible shared sequencer. And so 8 months happened. And then after 8 months, there was another research post in November 2023, which kind of suggested how we could potentially do base pre-confirmations. And I actually don't recommend that you read this second ETH research post, because the techniques that were suggested were just unnecessarily complicated. And now we have an extremely simple design for base pre-confirmations. Now, in order to actually get pre-confirmations in production, there's a lot of actors that need to all work together. And so to a very large extent, the success of base sequencing and pre-confirmations depends on the social layer. And so this is what I want to highlight in the rest of the talk. So the based social layer starts in February 2024 with the very first sequencing and pre-confirmation call. We had 40 people attend this call. And since then, we've had 16 calls and 200 attendees. And generally speaking, it's like 50 to 60 attendees to these calls. So the attendees are very much repeat attendees that have a lot of of shared beliefs. And like these shared beliefs are around the fact that we can indeed fix Ethereum fragmentation, that we do indeed want extremely low latency, even lower than Solana, right? Just ping time latency, and that we also want a very large amount of credible neutrality. And on call number 7 on May 10th, it was a bit of a pivotal call in the sense that we had made a lot of progress on the research, and we had visibility that Tycho was about to launch very, very soon. And so what I did is that I looked at the big shelling points that were going to happen in the rest of the year. So there was going to be Zoo Berlin, EthCC, and Devcon, with Edge City just happening just before Devcon. And so what I suggested is, why don't we try and do the following? Why don't we try and have a DevNet at Zoo Berlin, a testnet around EthCC, and then mainnet around Devcon? And let's see what happened. Well, in June 2024, at Zoo Berlin, we had basically sequencing days. We all came together, and a small group of hackers basically hacked up the first DevNet. And then in Brussels, we had sequencing day as well, and we had the very first preconf testnet. And so now the question is, are we ready for mainnet after Devcon? There's only 1 day left. This is the last day of Devcon, and the answer is yes. So just a few hours ago, I posted a tweet saying that yes, we now have the very first based pre-confirmations on mainnet. So yeah, congratulations to everyone who participated in that. It was a massive undertaking. Now, one of the things that has kind of astonished me and surprised me, above and beyond my expectations, is this ecosystem that has grown around sequencing and base sequencing. So initially, when it all started, it was basically just Tycho. Tycho is a very early mover. They were based before even the term was coined, based. And then since then, there's so many projects that have joined the fold. And one of the things that I'm excited about is that these projects very much collaborate with each other. So this is like kind of a small subset, I guess, of the links and collaborations between the teams. A lot have happened in the last few days and weeks, as we'll discuss. But fundamentally, this is a collaborative effort, and working together is critical. Now, one of the things that I've experienced is that the topic of base sequencing and base rollups is very counterintuitive. And the initial reaction of almost everyone is, I don't like it. It doesn't work, it kind of sucks. And even like within the Ethereum Foundation research team, I was a contrarian. Like it was basically me versus everyone else who thought I was crazy. But over time, what happens is that as people kind of better understand the fundamentals, they tend to flip one by one, and I've yet to find someone who became base pilled and then didn't become base kind of lost interest in base sequencing. But on the other hand, like every single day, I talk to people who tell me, yeah, now I get it. I mean, I was moderating a panel the other day, and one of the questions I asked them is, how base pilled are you out of 10 today? And one of them said between 7 and 8, and the other 3 said 10 out of 10. And then I asked them, how base pilled were you when you first discovered the concept? And they were like, 1 out of 10. So I think that the kind of the fundamentals are strong, and the narrative, I guess, is lagging, which is what we want. Now, one of the things that happened recently is Vitalik flipped. Like he was kind of on the camp of not having base sequencing, but recently he sent me this message. He says, by the way, I'm becoming more bullish on pre-confirmations, and I think that things will bifurcate in terms of sequencers between like the super centralized stuff, so centralized sequencers, and the base sequencing. There's going to be very little in the middle. That doesn't make as much sense. Might as well go for one of the extremes. Now, one of the things that has been very exciting to see is that at Devcon there's been a lot of events around sequencing, including this one. So there's 3 here, and then there's another 2, and then there's even 5 events that I haven't listed here because I couldn't find an image for them or they were private events. So lots of excitement around Devcon. And on top of that, there's 3 different talks at the main venue that have base rollups in the title. And I'm not part of the Devcon committee. I didn't help select these talks. And so I think that shows that there's just a lot of maturity that has happened in very, very little time. Now, one of the things that has happened in the last few days, and this has really boosted the speed at which we're moving forward, is Sequencing Week. Sequencing Week happened in Chiang Mai just a few days ago in Thailand. And the idea is to have attendees come together and live together over several weeks potentially, and build cool stuff. And what happened is that during Sequencing Week, we had 60 builders from 30 sequencing teams. And what happened is that we basically focused on the first day on just getting everyone to know each other so that we can facilitate this collaboration in the rest of the week. And so we all went climbing, we all loved it. And we visited all sorts of caves and we went hiking. And then for days 2 to 5, the mandate was ship. And people were just grinding all week. And they formed 9 different teams where each team basically had a key deliverable that they had to work on. So there was, for example, a standardization of the gateway APIs. And the key deliverable was to write an ERC, like a formal ERC, so that we can point to it and have a formal number. We had people work on this universal registration contract. We had Tim Bako, for example, bought the basesequencing.org domain name, and they're working on an educational website. Luca, who's the one of the key guys behind L2Beat, he started working on a classification of sequencing that could potentially be used within layer 2 L2Beat. And then all sorts of other things, including interop, and here the mainnet preconfirmations that I talked about with Kubi leading that effort. And so this is the photo that we took after day 4. The group shrank a little bit, but it's still very much most of the attendees that were still there on day 4. Like these are the true grinders who made it for photo time. And it just shows like the commitment that these people had, kind of showing up all day for over the course of a whole week. And so basically my claim, my hope is that we're at a point where we've reached escape velocity for base sequencing. Even though it's very much a contrarian idea when it started, hopefully it will blossom on mainnet. And one of the reasons why I'm saying this is because I'm looking to, in some sense, move to a new mission, right? I made this announcement of the beam chain. This is the thing that I'm going to be working on. And so, I've closed various other things in the past, and to a large extent, this is my my farewell to the base sequencing effort. And that's it. Thank you. Happy to take some questions. Do we have? Yeah, we have more mics. Question there, and a question there.
Hey Justin,
Hey.
So for a person who is not based build,
Yeah.
could you quickly explain the difference and let's say the use cases for centralized sequencing and the based sequencing? As you said that you see the split.
Yes. So centralized sequencing is the de facto standard today for L2s, and it has many, many advantages. One is that it's extremely simple to set up. It provides out of the box 3 different things that are difficult to do in a decentralized context. Number 1 is MEV protection. So as a user, I send my transaction directly to the sequencer, and I'm basically trusting the sequencer not to front run me. The second thing that the sequencer does is basically provide security training wheels. So the way that these rollups are meant to be secured against anyone is with the snark proofs and the fraud proofs. But what if there is a bug in the snark circuit or the fraud proof game? Then the good news is that if the centralized sequencer is honest, then you can't exploit the bug. And the reason is that the shared sequencer will only create blocks that are honestly created and don't exploit some sort of edge case vulnerability that a black hat would want to exploit. And then the final thing that the centralized sequencers provide out of the box, which is difficult to do in a decentralized context, is have ultra low latency UX. So you have the Optimism superchain that uses 2-second block times. You have Arbitrum that uses 250 millisecond block times. Basically what I think will happen, I think there is a big desire to basically move away from centralized sequencers because they also have downsides. So one downside is that they're a regulatory choke point. They're not a good look, right? Because it goes against the ethos of the space. They cause on a semi-regular basis accidental liveness failures. So it's many of the L2s just go offline for minutes or hours on a random basis. It's a vector for censorship. And maybe the thing that I'm most concerned about is that it is basically a limitation to composability. So when you have a centralized sequencer, it creates a silo around it, and you lose this notion of shared sequencing. And so the way that I think about it is that centralized sequencing is an anti-network effect, right? It's almost like having very, very high gas fees, right? Like when Ethereum was growing and growing and growing, the growth stopped because there were anti-network effects compensating for the network effects. And I think here we're saying the same thing. Like we're growing, 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 but the growth is in these silos, and these silos prevent the network effects from really kicking in a big way. So I think the whole industry is going to move to decentralized sequencing, and they're going to have to resolve all of these hard issues: MEV protection, security training wheels, and preconfirmations. And I think preconfirmations is especially relevant for base sequencing because it has the long slot times, but it's also relevant, I think, for any other decentralized sequencer. And the reason is that if you have a modestly decentralized sequencer, even with only 100 validators, you're going to have a hard time pushing the block time down to anything less than 1 second. And the delta between 1 second and 1 millisecond is huge. Right? Basically, from the UX perspective, is going to be the ping time to reach the sequencer plus the slot time, which could be or the tick time. So I think most of the work to move to decentralized sequencers is going to happen over the next few years, and then the question becomes: which decentralized sequencer do you want? Do you want one that you control, for example, where all of the MEV goes to your token, or do you want to have a shared sequencer? My thesis is that you're going to want to opt into the shared sequencers, not to the decentralized sequencer that you control. And the reason is that even though you might lose some MEV, you gain so much more composability and therefore more congestion fees from the increased traffic that you get. And today, if you look at the L1, the ratio between congestion fees and MEV is roughly 4:1. And I think this is going to keep on increasing because MEV is going down and down over time relative to congestion fees with things like encrypted mempools and whatnot. So long story short, decentralized sequencing, in a vacuum kind of helps against liveness failures, censorship, misalignment and with the ethos and things like that. But if you really zoom out to the ecosystem-wide opportunity, decentralized sequencing is basically all about unlocking shared sequencing in a credibly neutral way.
Hey, Justin. My question is, how do you feel about the proposer monopoly within Ethereum? Is it something that's a non-issue, something that we're keen to keep? Is it something that we should be designing away? Is it orthogonal or directly related to preconfs?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the things that we want to do for at least the L1 is mitigate the downsides of the monopoly. And I think the main downside is that you can basically censor. And the solution that we're proposing is inclusion lists. And specifically, there's this proposal that recently got an EIP called Fossil. And Fossil, the way it works is that at every slot, you have 16 proposers that build inclusion lists. And then you take the union of all of those inclusion lists, and that is the starting point for the proposer, the execution proposer, to build their block. And they're very much constrained in the sense that they have to include those transactions, and the only things that they can do is reorder the transactions and insert their own transactions. And so the mental model that I'm trying to encourage people to have is that almost all of the block building happens at the inclusion list level. You should think of it as, you know, the raw material from which you build a sculpture, for example, you know, is the lump of clay, and then, you know, you have the builder kind of shaping it on here and there, but like ultimately what matters the most is that all of the raw material is there. Now, having a monopoly entity still have some power, I think is extremely valuable. And the reason is that they can provide additional services. So one additional service, for example, that these proposers can provide is reversion protection, right? So they can always make sure that the only transactions that make it on chain are transactions that will always succeed and never revert. They can, you know, make sure that transactions that need to be next to each other are next to each other. So basically, they can create synergies that would otherwise not be possible because they have this external view over the real world. And then the final kind of service that they can provide to the world is basically pre-confirmations. The fact that they have monopoly power is the reason why they can, with very high guarantees, make these promises that will almost certainly be honored in the future, because otherwise they get slashed. And so, yeah, I think there's basically been this debate, right, with basically the ideas from Max Resnick. So what Max Resnick is suggesting is what he calls it's a deterministic ordering rule. So you have all of these inclusion lists, and then you just order transactions decreasing by priority fee. And if you do that, you actually lose a lot of the synergies. You lose the revert protection. You lose the ability to put transactions that need to be next to each other, and you also lose the ability. So that would be synchronous composability, for example, and you also lose the preconfs. And then the alternative way of doing it is what we call the agentic ordering rule, where an agent, which we call the execution proposer, has control over the ordering. This is a bit of a side note, but we had a workshop in Vienna a few months ago where, you know, many different researchers from the EF and outside of the EF, including Max Resnick, all came together to discuss, you know, the trade-offs of agentic versus deterministic ordering rule. And at some point, I kind of made an informal poll asking people, you know, where do you stand? And there was basically one person who was in favor for the deterministic ordering rule, and everyone else in favor of the agentic determinist ordering rule. So I think at this point in time, the consensus, the rough consensus, seems to be around the agentic ordering rule. And the way that this expresses itself, for example, would be with Fossil plus something like APS, so an execution auction or execution ticket.
Are there any other questions? Otherwise, I have a question. Okay, you go. I go first? You sure? Okay. So, Justin, you motivate. You said the reason why rollups would use base sequencing over running their own decentralized sequencers is primarily around composability, right?
Yes.
Specifically around being able to share a sequencer, credibly neutral sequencer, and then that enables synchronous composability. What do you think about the fact, though, that all the things that enable synchronous composability, like fast real-time ZK proofs, etc., also enable very fast asynchronous composability? And if you're going to lower the block times of the L1, which is maybe the one reason why asynchronous composability would still not be fast today with the L1 without sharing a sequencer. Because you'd have to do multiple rounds. You can't do multiple rounds of communication between an L2 and the L1 without sharing a sequencer. If you're going to lower the block times and you have real-time ZK proofs, you know, what is really the delta that people are getting from synchronous composability that's going to drive them to share a sequencer as opposed to not, right?
Right, great question. So I kind of see two possible outcomes here. Like, outcome one is that we don't have shared sequencing, you know, on paper, but in practice we do have shared sequencing. And the reason is that there's like these n sequencers, and even though like the different entities, like behind the scenes, they're all colluding, you know, or communicating with each other to provide this shared sequencing. And you could imagine, you know, having very fancy like TE infrastructure with Suave and whatnot, where they all come together, you know, in a trustless way, and they, even though they're separate entities, like they express these intents of wanting to work together and unlock synergies. And basically what you would end up with is basically this virtual shared sequencer, which internally is made out of non-shared sequencers, and it is just a system that is 10x more complex. Like, you might as well just go with the shared sequencers to start with, as opposed to rebuilding this shared sequencer outside. The other way that I could see basically the full value being provided is you know, maybe more at the language and programming level. I mean, maybe this is I need to think it through, but like one of the observations that I have basically is that any system, blockchain ecosystem that has tried to push to their devs an asynchronous programming environment, whether that's Cosmos, Polkadot, Near, Ton, and Internet Computer. Basically, it's a very awkward programming model, and programmers don't like it. And I think this is, to a very large extent, you know, part of the reason why these ecosystems haven't blossomed in a big way. And so, like, one potential way to kind of still get the DevX of synchrony, but kind of behind the scenes have asynchrony is with this programming level abstraction, where, you know, you write everything in Solidity, and then somehow there's like some magic compiler stuff happening in the background, and it will use asynchrony and abstract that away from the developers. Again, like, I think if you put a lot of, you know, of effort in the compilers, or a lot of effort in the off-chain infrastructure to simulate a shared sequencer, I think you end up with a net more complex system. And I would just go with the most straightforward one, which is just go with shared sequencing to start with.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Yeah. I saw in the slide where you were sharing part of a conversation with Vitalik that there was this argument of eventually only having centralized sequencers or based. I mean, basically centralized sequencing rollups or based rollups. That seems like 6 order of magnitudes of differences between 1 million validators and one sequencer. So I'm wondering, what's the logic of not of what is that logic for eventually reaching that?
Yeah, so the way that I see it is that once you have a decentralized sequencer, whether or not there's, you know, 1 million or 1,000 or 100, doesn't really matter, because at any given slot you have the monopoly, and really what you want is very high economic security, and you also want like very good UX, which any decentralized sequencer will have with the pre-confirmations, right? If pre-confirmations work with base sequencing, they also work with non-based sequencing as well. Now, I think the big thing that Vitalik is worried about is that in some fraction of the slots, so X% of the time, there won't be a validator that's online. So for example, on Ethereum today, roughly 20 basis points, so 0.2% of all of the validators have lost their keys. They're just permanently offline. And so in those slots, they're not going to provide pre-confirmations just because they're not online. And so from a UX perspective, you know, it's like amazing, 99.9% 0.8% of the time, and then 2% of the time is terrible. You have to wait a whole 12 seconds. And this is part of the reason why I think reducing the slot times on L1 is valuable, because it basically mitigates against this failure case where you have to fall back to the slow confirmation for inclusion and execution. But I think what Vitalik is basically saying is that the centralized sequencer, it gives you homogeneity. So in every single slot, you have the exact same user experience. One of the downsides of decentralized sequencers is that each sequencer, when they rotate, they're in a different geography. And so if you're playing a game, for example, you might have like 50 milliseconds for 12 seconds latency, and it switches to someone in Australia, and then now you have 300 millisecond latency, and then the UX is not great. So I think base sequencing is not ideal for games, but things other than games, I think, especially financial stuff, should probably use base sequencing.